All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Lisa Watersvern, Director of Government and Community Affairs for Benetech. And today I will be moderating this important conversation. It takes an ecosystem, harnessing tech and community for education equity. This is the second in a three-part series of programs around inclusive education, and will focus on how technology and community can come together to enable inclusive access to personalized learning. This is especially important for students with reading barriers who face additional challenges due to racial injustice and socioeconomic status. Some of the topics that have come up in our pre-event discussion on LinkedIn raise questions about education as the foundation for career paths, comprehensive assistive tech models, and how advocacy and innovation can drive equity both inside and outside the system. We have a panel of experts representing key pieces of that ecosystem, and we'll have them share their perspectives. Joining us today on our panel is Susan Winslow, President of Macmillan Learning Publishing, a significant champion of STEM education. So thank you, Susan. Dr. Art Cavazos, Superintendent in Residence, Holdsworth Center, and former Superintendent at Harlingen Consolidated Independent School District in Texas. Welcome, Art. Next, we have Dr. Sean Robinson, AKA Dr. Dyslexia Dude, who's here as a noted educational scholar, an author, a reading instructor at Madison College, as well as a senior research associate in Wisconsin's Equity and Inclusion at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Dr. Dyslexia Dude. And finally, joining us today is Natalie Wexler, who is an education writer and author of The Knowledge Gap, the hidden cause of America's broken education system and how to fix it. We're excited to join you guys today, but we have a few things to go over before that. We want to also hear from you. So during this conversation, we encourage you to weigh in on the question and answer panel at the bottom of your screen. So as we go through, we want to make sure we add your voice. And at the end of this, we'll have an opportunity to answer some of those questions. But before, I want to note that this webinar is being recorded. Only the panelists that are visible on the screen will actually be recorded. And we'll post this recording and additional information later on in the week via the LinkedIn event page. We have that Q&A box I mentioned. It's enabled, which is part of the Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to put in your questions at any point. If we don't get to your question during the event, no worries. We will do our best to follow up with you. And live captioning today is provided by ACS Captions. To turn your captions on, use the CC or closed caption option in the Zoom controls menu at the bottom right of your screen. You can also access an AT-friendly stream text transcript in your browser at the link provided in the chat. All right, you guys ready to begin?
Yes.
All right. So as many as 1 in 5 learners may have a learning or reading barrier, such as dyslexia. Since the Individuals with Disability Education Act, IDEA, was passed in 1975, there has been a clear awareness in the education system that we must provide accommodations and accessible educational materials to support our learners. I'm going to introduce each of our panels with a question about the role they play in the education ecosystem related to this. And then we'll get more interactive and see where the conversation goes. So I'm going to go in the order that I introduced our panelists today. And because publishing plays such an important role in the ecosystem, from content to end user, let's start with Susan Winslow of Macmillan Learning, which has been the first education solution company to become global certified accessible, providing born accessible digital learning, ebooks, options for students with disabilities. Susan, as a publisher of educational content, you know that digital does not necessarily mean accessible. So when we talk about digital transformation, what do you see the role of publishing in connecting accessible content with equity, empowering all students to grow into successful readers and learners?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It is so great to be here and the role that I get to play on this panel, mostly because I think as partners in this ecosystem, together we've shown that we can make great advances. And especially when we approach equity issues, not sort of as a series of requirements to meet or boxes to tick, but rather as an interesting and important problem to solve, as opportunities for these publishing businesses. And so, in our case, with the rise of digital usage in schools, we saw an opportunity to rethink the development of the ebook. And working with Benetech and others, we found a way to create these materials such that they were born digital, as you were mentioning, and are ready to use now with a variety of assistive technologies. And so ultimately, we did two things that I think were significant. This led to better access and save time for students and a better experience for them. And then as the publisher here, we also lowered our costs. Instead of creating various handovers and versions of e-texts for each technology, we just approached it as you would any digital endeavor these days. And so we brought our costs down in the long run too. So it was successful on many fronts. When we started, we didn't know that a pandemic was coming, but we were awfully thankful that we had this wrapped up just before everybody went online. And so, what we realized was that the reach of these born accessible products, was greatly amplified during COVID. And I think, at least anecdotally, what we discovered is that we saved a lot of students, parents, teachers, a lot of time and frustration because the ebook was able to transition a little more easily than in the past. So, and of course, I personally am so proud that we got to be the first and continued recipient of Benetech's Global Certified Accessible designation. It's meant so much to the employees of Macmillan Learning. And indeed, I think it spurred a sort of continued enthusiasm for us on our equity journey. At the same time we were working on the new ebook process, we also launched a new learning platform called Achieve, which was built on the latest learning science. And so our strong partnerships with you, Benetech, and companies like Tech for All have allowed us to actually improve our processes and to build the content in other ways accessible, being born accessible from the beginning. And I know how much our authors have appreciated that. We've made it easier for them to create content for students. I think our science labs program has advanced greatly on this front, which was always sort of a difficult area to make accessible. We have a program called iClicker, which is basically student engagement software. And again, we've been advancing substantially there in the digital environment. So our work and our journey continues, but it's such a great moment to have partners that can really help you there. So, the end game is we recognize there's really no reason that students with disabilities shouldn't have the same access to all learning materials as their peers. And for that and so many more reasons, we've developed and continue to nurture a culture of continuous innovation on our front so that our products can be used successfully by everybody, which is our end game.
That's wonderful. And I really appreciate that component of everybody, because when we have books that can be used in a variety of different ways, we really are addressing the unique learning styles of our learners who really, rely on the flexibility in education. So thank you so much. Accessible content truly is the critical first step. So thank you. I'm going to move on now to Dr. Art Cavazos, who is an expert in educational technology and leadership, as well as curriculum development. You understand the influence that school administrators have on what we're buying and how content is produced or purchased and incorporated into the curriculum. I'm sure you have some best practices you can share with us, not only from your firsthand experience as in a district that had a population of underserved students, but also from a conversation you just moderated with other superintendents across Texas to discuss early literacy. I'm going to rephrase that a little bit. How would you describe the new structure for equitable personalized learning that, in addition to basics like connectivity and screenings, you incorporate tools that students can leverage for digital literacy?
So thank you, Lisa. And I want to thank everybody for inviting me. Benetech, great. And Susan, you did a great job. I want to start by first giving a little context to where I'm at and as far as Geographically, I see people from Germany have logged in. I'm in the state of Texas, and there are about 1,200 superintendents in the state of Texas that oversee about 5.4 million students. And so if you take that context, I want to share with you a little bit of what we've learned during the pandemic and this whole reality shift that we're going through. First, we want to acknowledge the fact that the pandemic illuminated some very dark corners of our school system. And I would say that they were dark because we chose to keep them in the dark. One was that there was limited access, there was lack of technology, there was a digital gap, there was connectivity gaps. It illuminated that because school systems were asked to pivot to an online platform of learning. And what we realized was that we had a heavy lift ahead of us. Here are the lessons learned that I think can inform our practice moving forward when it comes to technology and access and literacy. We are very resilient as a society. There remains a high dependency on neighborhood schools for answers for our parents who otherwise are disenfranchised from schools. The digital gap was more significant in teachers on how to use technology than it was in students. However, the access gap was more significant in students. Connectivity was not a norm for students unless they were in our schools. Literacy and access were the true challenges during the pandemic for students and adults alike. Here are the challenges moving forward that I see as a superintendent and a former superintendent, and now using a megaphone to push this narrative and change the narrative. We must fight this notion of returning to normal because there are some parts of normal that it's not worth running back to. Mm-hmm. And so we need to redefine our space. We must fight regression to the mean. We must create a coalition for continued change. Technology is our friend. All the things that Susan talked about. We have been telling teachers this is great opportunities, but that gap was real. We must focus on literacy, starting strong and finishing strong. We must continue to close the digital and the access gap. We shouldn't waste a crisis. This gives us a chance to redefine ourselves and reset ourselves. We must continue to challenge our current bureaucracies and our programs and our systems that keep us from doing the great things. However, that sounds great, but let me tell you, there's great opportunities here as well. I think that we need to engage in dialogue that move people from compliance to commitment, to doing things differently. We need to use equity and access as a new lens to do the right work and strategically abandon the wrong work. To the importance of literacy, early literacy, making the 4 C's as part of all lessons across our country: communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking, which align beautifully to STEM. Because at the end of the day, kids are gonna do well if they're prepared in those 4 C's. We must recommit to the use of technology to ensure equity in accessing digital books, a commitment to making literacy and access to books and use of technology a priority. Enough. We must re-engage into this work. Let's remind ourselves every day that the little people are waiting for the big people to get it right, and we're the big people. Don't miss an opportunity to make a difference. Let's play chess and not checkers. Let's be very strategic in how we move forward. Let's use this pandemic to launch us to a better place, what we can do for kids, because equity is a real issue. There's a big disparity between equality and equity, and people don't understand the difference. Let's use equity as a new lens moving forward. I'm super excited. These are the kind of conversations that need to take place. Thank you for inviting me, Lisa.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I really appreciate your comment about moving from compliance to commitment. And I think that goes to how tech can and could be used in the classrooms that it's not just where you are if you're in a physical workspace, that to be able to use things offline in places where you may not have that natural connectivity that others have, to really help level that playing field a little bit. So thank you. I want to get back to a little bit more on that. Hopefully we'll have time in the Q&A, but I want to take some time now to shift to Dr. Sean Anthony Robinson, Dr. Dyslexia Dude. And for those of you who do not know who Dr. Dyslexia Dude is, I wanted to just really quickly open it up to Dr. Robinson to give us a brief overview of that before I launch into his important question. Do you mind telling us a little bit about Dr. Dyslexia Dude?
Oh, sure. Thank you for the opportunities to be here. And it's great to be among like minds, people pushing forward of equity, particularly with the context of reading and literacy. Dr. Dyslexia Dude is a superhero with dyslexia, graphic novel that my wife and I wrote to really inspire kids with dyslexia, but particularly Black and brown kids, to really see themselves as being scholars, creativity, right? Let me think about, them for success. And so we really want to hit home to have a representation in literature that speaks to students, to get them engaged in reading and gets them to love reading and be creative. And so my wife and I wrote 3 volumes, particularly within the context of race and literacy. We want really students just to take off and love to read and be consumers of reading and see themselves in literature. And so that's really what the book's about, to empower students to dress up in outfits, no matter how old they are or young they are, right? To be creative, right? Because that's what reading does. It opens up a mind to imagination. So we really want just to have kids have that access to, high quality books that reflect who they are and their experiences too.
Yeah, thank you. And I will say to all of you out there, the panel does have a little wardrobe envy right now. We had those discussions prior to you all joining us. We were trying to see what kind of fun things we could join, but Dr. Dyslexia Dude got us in the place. So Dr. Robinson, you actually have a unique perspective because you are a creator of this content, as you just described, but you're also an educator and a student with dyslexia. So what do you believe are the key factors to create this ecosystem that truly supports this equity in education?
Yeah, I think my colleagues really addressed it in their opening remarks. It's commitment, it's building a community and building awareness and giving students access to this knowledge, and particularly parents too. A lot of times parents are outside the door trying to get in or trying to get into the rooms to make decisions, and they might not know the information that they need to provide them the right instruction that they can help their son or daughters with. And so there's a disconnect sometimes between the community and the academy. And so how can we bridge that to really level the playing field, particularly for students with learning disabilities, but also students that come from underserved communities that may not have the social capital or the cultural capital needed to move forward within this space of literacy. At the community college, I work with a lot of adult learners who struggle with reading, and most of them are reading at an elementary level, maybe middle school, and they haven't had access to high quality instruction before. So again, it's just leveraging technology to provide them access to this knowledge, because once they get the access, they become consumers and they absorb the knowledge and they just take off. They become independent, they become confident, and they become empowered. And that's what we need to do, particularly at a younger age with students, is really have them believe themselves and give them the right instruction so they can become CEOs, doctors, lawyers, superintendents, authors, and just dream and live their dreams into reality. And particularly within the context of the pandemic, it's really shown us between the haves and the have-nots. It's really divided a lot of classes. It doesn't matter if you're white, black, rich. It has divided many people from getting access to things that can help them in terms of their academic ability and also literacy too. And literacy is liberation. If you can't read, well, you're not going to have a very joyful life and experience trying to navigate a space. Everything is full of literacy: print, read, write, speak. And so but just access and equality and finding ways to really leverage that for students and give them hope, right? And that's what we try to do in our respective fields.
Thank you, Sean. That perspective is why you have been such an amazing advisor for Benetech. So thank you for that as well.
Welcome.
Natalie, you've covered some important issues around education and the system and how reading and writing are tied to literacy. So the question I have for you today is, what do you believe is working and not working in the education system? especially as it relates to equity and preparing all students for careers in industry like STEM?
Yeah, well, thanks to Benetech and to you, Lisa, for inviting me. And I think I have probably a more radical critique of the American education system than most. And I would say it really only works currently for students who would probably thrive no matter what. So they're not thriving because of our education system, they're actually thriving despite it. And those students tend to come from more highly educated families in our society, that they tend to be the wealthier families. And they start out with an important advantage, the advantage of having been exposed to more academic knowledge and vocabulary pretty much from birth. And that is an enormous advantage in an academic setting. Now, other students depend on school for that kind of knowledge and vocabulary. You'd think that's what they'd be getting. But in our current system, they're actually the least likely to get that academic knowledge from school. And as a result, the gap between these two groups of students just gets wider with every passing school year. So by the time they get to high school, it can be extremely wide and difficult to narrow. So why do I say that not all kids are acquiring academic knowledge at school? Well, broadly speaking, I'd say it's because our entire education system, this is a sweeping statement, but I do have a basis for it. Our entire system, including teacher training, curriculum, instructional materials, and education policy, all of that rests on assumptions that are in conflict with what scientists have discovered about how the learning process actually works. Essentially, we've prioritized learning through discovery and inquiry, at least in theory. And although those things have their place, in fact, what learners need when they're new to a topic, as so many of our students are, is effective, explicit instruction. And perhaps the most damaging aspect of this system is the amount of time that schools are spending on what are called reading comprehension skills. So, there are two basic aspects to reading. There is deciphering words, and then there's understanding the words. And we have problems with both of those aspects. But when it comes to trying to teach kids comprehension, we've been focusing on what we think of as skills, like finding the main idea, especially at the elementary level. And especially in the last 20 years, as reading tests have become so important, that kind of instruction has really edged out content-rich subjects like social studies and science in the curriculum. And the theory has been that it really doesn't matter so much if kids aren't learning anything substantive in those earlier years, as long as they're acquiring the skills, like finding the main idea, that will enable them to gain knowledge from whatever they read later on. The problem here is, as cognitive scientists have long known, the key factor in reading comprehension, which is crucial to all learning, it isn't abstract skill. There is no abstract skill of finding the main idea. It's really knowledge, either knowledge of the topic or really academic knowledge and vocabulary in general. That's what fuels reading comprehension. So if we want all students to succeed, we should actually be doing the opposite of what we're currently doing, beginning at the elementary level. We should be immersing kids in subjects like social studies and science, beginning in kindergarten. And that's going to set them up for success in later years rather than setting them up for failure, which is essentially what we have been doing. But I do want to end here on a positive note. And the good news is that more and more schools and districts across the country are beginning to adopt a new kind of elementary literacy curriculum that does focus on building academic knowledge for all children, beginning in kindergarten. And we are seeing some very promising results from that.
Wonderful. Well, we do have a question from the audience, and I think it dovetails really nicely into what you said, Natalie. But I will open it up to the entire panel to get your thoughts on this as well. This question comes from Andrew Paul McIntosh. He asks, what are some of the most effective ways that have been proposed to reduce the access gap? So Natalie, you gave us a few with the curriculum, but what are some of the other things that you've experienced, Dr. Cavazos, Dr. Robinson, Susan, that could address that gap?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in real quick. And Natalie, thank you for all those comments and broad statements about our current condition. I think that there's an appetite to change the trajectory and the narrative. And I'm seeing a lot of examples of that of the real focus on early literacy. And that's where we need to start, give them a strong start. With regards to access, what we found, I come from a district of about 19,000 students, and what we found is that it wasn't so much about giving them access, because we were issuing out hotspots. There weren't enough towers out there where hotspots could access. And so you had a double kind of problem here, where students may have had the tools, but they couldn't get connected, right? Because they were in rural areas. And so some of the very unique ways to address this, because remember, we were in a pandemic where social distancing was still a requirement, right? And kids couldn't congregate. So many districts moved to a park and learn system where they opened their internet accessibility at all campuses. And it was almost like when you would go to the drive-in movie, you would park in the parking lot and download all the information you needed. But it was really about the digital tools, right? And so I was excited when Susan was talking about all the content that, and I'm telling you, very often when we adopt books or we adopt these resources, that's the last thing that teachers access. And now it's the first thing people are asking for and saying, what is it offering for us? Because we realized that the gap didn't exist on how to use technology in kids. The gap was on connectivity. The other very unique way in which districts address the connectivity issue is that they sent out all their buses as hotspots, and they became pseudo kind of towers where they had all the equipment and kids could kind of connect to the buses in their neighborhood. And we parked the buses and they became connect hotspots, right? The other way, and I think that it was really great that some districts were able to do this, they partnered with their local municipalities to stand up the towers to allow for connectivity in the most isolated areas. And so here's what I want to say when I give those examples. We can do this. We don't need a pandemic to push us in this direction. We should be sounding the alarm and saying, we have an obligation to do this. But let me tell you that unless we retrain our teachers and retrain our systems, regression to the mean is going to happen. And people are going to use technology as a very expensive pencil in the classroom. And so it is incumbent on us and everyone who is trying to change the narrative to continue to push this narrative, because the reality is that we don't want to go back to where we were. We weren't perfect. We have an opportunity here to do a reset button. And I have the highest hopes. And I like that Natalie said, I'm going to leave you with some hope and some excitement, because I do. I have a lot of hope that we're moving in the right direction.
I can only second that. I think we also learned, so we had two things happen that were significant. One is the support needs, instructors calling us saying, I have to set up a hybrid or all remote course, and I don't actually know more than the basics, but I have to be proficient in these systems now. We went into like a 3,000-fold increase in the time we spent supporting teachers and instructors. And what we were learning from all of that is, yes, like the way I think people thought of these tools in their classroom changed, right? It went from sort of a side thing to, I really need to actually try to meet the student outcomes that I was trying to meet before with a different set. So we learned a lot about sort of how to help people implement best practice around their outcomes, what they wanted to do originally and how that can be advanced. And then same exact thing, finding out that the best tools in the world, are used differently when a student is in a remote area and is connecting in a car outside of, something and trying to then run it. So it has spurred us into thinking a little bit differently about how we parse content, how we're going to help a student through something, imagining them on a phone or on a laptop in a car. There's improvements we can make there, and are definitely making.
Well, even the teachers, right, wanting to deliver instruction traditionally when they were on a virtual platform. And some teachers delivered an entire lesson and they were muted the whole time. And the kids were like scratching their head and saying, hello, but we learned that. And look, we've been in this pandemic. The first year, it took us about 4 months to stand up a virtual platform that it was effective to the points that we were looking at. So imagine the launch that we did, and imagine how much time, how much space we covered. Why are we waiting for a pandemic to continue the momentum?
If I could just add something, I was just learning today about what sounds like a very promising initiative in Texas, as it happens, where they were spurred by the pandemic to create a website called Texas Home Learning, which has a content-rich knowledge-building curriculum that is accessible to not only every teacher, but every parent in the state of Texas. And it's designed to help teachers teach either in the classroom or remotely or in a hybrid situation, and also to enable parents to support their kids with education. So that strikes me as a wonderful marriage of technology and the kind of knowledge building curriculum that I'm talking about.
Sean, did you want to add anything? If not, I have a quick statement.
When I first started teaching at the community college, I started right when the pandemic hit, and they shifted completely to online learning, asynchronous, online live, and I love it. Like, I've been able to figure things out. My creativity, as being, Dr. Dyslexia dude writing books, I really found a way to make the content accessible for students, adult learners. And even now I'm teaching a high school class now on reading, and it's all virtually. And I really find there's value in it if we can really harness and figure out how to keep students engaged with it. I mean, to sit in front of a computer for anybody can be taxing, right? But if we can find a way to get them engaged like they were on the Xbox or PS3 or the Nintendo, right? Like, if we can find ways to harness that same motivation, I think it's a win-win for everybody. And so I figured some things out at the community college, particularly within the asynchronous online live, that really provides students access to knowledge, gets them engaged, and we've seen a great turnaround in terms of their retention rates for these adult learners. So I think it's just, to me, it's about being creative and how to find ways to get them hooked. Once they get hooked, I think, it's a game over. But again, as my colleague said, it's hard for a lot of students who may not have access, right? Hotspots, their internet might be down, might be kind of, broken up at some points, and some may be in their cars traveling. So again, it's trying to be really sensitive to their needs and how to, provide the best platform for them and their needs.
And while I agree with everything that everyone said, I do think we can also take it one level further, right? Not just we have to be considerate to know if someone has a hotspot or that they have the right place to access information using technology, but is that technology actually, has it been developed in a way that can be used in multiple scenarios as well, right? Not having to rely on necessarily having access to internet, access to the broadband or whatever, right? And so I think that goes to some of the best practices on how technology should be created, right? And if it took us to this pandemic to realize this, again, shame on us, but we cannot let that go and not do something about it for the future. At Bookshare, one of the things that we've been able to do is provide books to students with reading barriers, both on and offline, because we know that a lot of the kids that need this service may only have access to it on a device at school or something at home that doesn't have internet connectivity, or they may just be using their phones. We know that mobile phones are one of the highest ways kids are interacting with tech and with their education. And so, again, it's thinking through, having those technology companies really thinking through how they design these products so that if we are implementing them and we are using them and we are encouraging our kids and our teachers to learn, that they're actually setting them up for success and not just for mediocrity. So with that, though, we did get an interesting question. Unless, Susan, did you want to add to that real quick? Okay, we did get an interesting question, and I think it kind of goes well with where the direction that we're going at this point. This is from Dr. Tracy Whedon. How can a highly skilled teacher best leverage technology as a tool to accelerate student achievement? What about highly effective school or district leaders? And Dr. Cavasso, you mentioned a few times that the disconnect was not necessarily that the students didn't understand the tech, but that the teachers may not have understood it. Do you have recommendations based on your experience that can help answer Dr. Whedon's question?
Well, I think I'm not going to endorse any particular product, but I can tell you that there are some companies that have come a long way with the kind of products they put out to fill in that, what Sean was talking about, that excitement for kids to stay engaged, I want to caution us that we have to be careful not to overcorrect also, right? Because a human element and the social skills and the contact with adults and so forth for kids is equally important, right? But we don't need to be creating teacher-made lessons when there are so many opportunities out there and so many different systems and programs that allow for that gap to be closed. And you know, this conversation that Susan is engaged in and Benetech and so forth, it's sounding the alarm that we're working harder, but we need to be working smarter, right? And I will say this, that when you talk about kids and you losing connectivity, coming in and out and spotty and so forth, I had a kindergarten teacher at one of our roundtable discussions. She illuminated that and said, by the way, what that kid is experiencing with connectivity is what the kids are experiencing with gaps in reading and literacy. And they give up and they don't want to be engaged anymore. And so she was championing the early literacy work and not to lose sight of how important it is to work with kids so they can start strong. And so to me is this pandemic, while we don't like it, if we look at the opportunities that it's presented to us, I think we are going to be in a much better place moving forward.
Natalie, did you have some thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, I think what technology can do, I think there's enormous potential for technology, but I think it very much depends on the subject matter and whether. So I think one of the strengths of technology is in helping get skills and concepts into kids' long-term memories so that they have them to draw on in the future. And so for math skills, for decoding skills, that kind of practice, personalized, targeted practice can be very powerful. But what I've seen in a lot of classrooms is a reading comprehension software that just mimics not very well the same. I'm not criticizing teachers, this is a system, but the same ineffective reading comprehension instruction that you see delivered by human beings. And it really doesn't work any better if it's delivered by a computer. So I think we do need to get away from having kids sit in front of devices and practice finding the main idea or an equivalent on a bunch of random texts that's not building skills or knowledge. I do think technology can be very helpful. Things like having kids listen, audio books or listening to text being read aloud, sometimes while they're following along. That can be a very powerful boost to fluency in reading, things like that. But I think we have to be very careful about being specific about what the content is that we're talking about and what technology is really going to help with what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I guess I would only add to that too, that it is important to remember that the technology is a tool. It can be an important piece of the learning, but what we're trying to accomplish is still very much likely driven by human endeavor. And that's an important piece of it. You know, lots and lots of studies showing that human element in teaching is critical, especially at younger ages. So I think part of how to use technology, which I think was your question that came in, how do I implement it, is really thinking, what can it do? Learn about what certain tools can do to help move your students in your classroom to the outcomes that you want them to achieve. And I would argue that we're maybe even suggesting some outcomes around reading and content that maybe you introduce new for the first time, but that's then work backwards and say, okay, this is where I want to get my student to. What are the experiences I want to give them to drive at that set of outcomes? And that's where flexible technologies that are, I think, built with learning science underneath them so that they're effective, but can be molded with sort of around that human endeavor, will be most successful in the long run. And it allows for us to get more students through when implemented well.
And Susan, to your point, I think it needs to be prescriptive and very diagnostic, and we need to be very purposeful in the technology and the programs that we choose, because it should be hand in glove with high quality instruction. I totally agree with you. I think that it can't be in lieu of, but
right.
it's merged with, right? And so if every student moving forward had an individual educational plan, and we're really very prescriptive in what we're doing with kids and serving them, I think we're all better off with it, and technology can facilitate that process.
Yeah, I agree with all my colleagues 100%. You know, the work I do at the community college, and I'm also doing some teacher training. One tool that many people don't utilize is the dictionary, particularly online. It teaches you phonemes, graphemes, morphology. It teaches you the root words. And so that's a free tool that we can have students access for free at the fingertips, phone, so, you know, online. But if we really teach somebody how to use the dictionary correctly, it's a tool that they can use independently to help them in their reading, right? It's a supplemental tool. It's a strategy. If they can learn how to access the code and crack the code, linguistic skills, knowledge of the dictionary, and it's free, then they'll build confidence when they go to the actual reading courses. They'll have that background knowledge. So it's something that I do at the community college, and also with adult learners and adolescents and teachers, is help them understand how to actually use that tool as a strategy.
Well, and I think that brings us to another question that is sort of along that vein. Dr. Abigail Joseph asked, how can we help teachers become facilitators of learning and problem solving?
Well, I think it starts with training, right? And illuminating that that there is more than one way to deliver instruction, and it doesn't have to be the sage on the stage, right? It can be the facilitator of learning, and you're managing the learning, you're facilitating that. But I think it requires training. And I think one of my colleagues mentioned teacher preparation programs, and have we reinvented that? Have we re-engaged that part of the whole equation and the journey, right? But I think teacher training and how to facilitate the learning, because let's be honest, not all kids are at the same level in your classroom, right? And so we have to use everything that we have in the classroom. The teachers are very equipped and can be very equipped through valuable training on how to be a facilitator of learning rather than a sage on the stage.
And I think that piece, and this is just a former me, not necessarily a representative of Benetech, but that teacher training piece is important. And is it updated to where we are today in society? When I would teach, I had students who were seniors in college who would say, how do people learn about technology like this in special education classrooms if they don't take your class? Well, they should be learning, right? That should be something that we were thinking through. How does the technology, how is that immersed throughout their entire time in their teacher prep programs? And not just in one particular class. So I would agree that training is a key component in making sure that people have the right tools to go out and to be successful as well.
Yeah, I think the training piece is critical. It's the first step. Also in higher education, there's egos too at the table, right? And so you're dealing with a lot of egos. It gets in the way of allowing students to propel to be successful. Right? Every student should have an opportunity to excel. Every student should have an opportunity to dream and be creative. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes we find that there are egos at the table that interfere with students getting access to the knowledge and skills they need to move forward. So I just want to put it out there. I'm in space, so no one can get me. So I'm high up in that space, so you can't find me.
So I am going to switch this to sort of a different topic. So we've talked a little bit about technology and how we can help teachers, but we've been getting a series of questions specifically around parents. And so Sean, you talked a little bit about the disconnect between community and the academy and the importance of empowering parents to navigate this educational system and to advocate for their children. A specialized system that heavily relies on parents' advocacy and labor to the point that many parents have to become special education experts is reproducing inequity. As we're talking about building an ecosystem, how can we incorporate parents as that touch point between the academy or and the community? So, and can we ensure that parents don't have to fight to teach their children, to teach their children's needs? How, are there ways to center that thinking so that the problem, that we're looking for solutions when it comes to working around with parents. And I did an awful job paraphrasing that, but the whole question is, how can we help parents so that they don't have to feel like they need to become advocates for their children or experts in the field in order to get the services that are needed to make them, reach their maximum potential?
Communication, communication, communication. Bring them along in the journey. I will say that one of the concerns that we all should have in an ecosystem currently is that because of social distancing and because of the pandemic, we kept people out of our schoolhouses. We migrated kids back into the schoolhouses, but we kept all the other people out. And so we can gain a comfort level where there's no interruption of parents, and some people see it as an interruption. And so we need to push that narrative and say, we need to re-engage the parents, because at the end of the day, the parents are a critical component. I call it a three-legged stool, right? It's the parents, the teachers, and the students, right? And without one, it's not gonna sit properly. And so I think communication, 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 advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. And I think that it's gotta be a grassroots movement to re-engage the parents, to be asking the critical questions. And I think what we're gonna find is that technology has opened that door for parents to understand, hey, I can find things using technology now. I can find solutions to this and ask the right questions. And so I think parents are getting better at it because technology was imposed in their homes. But I think that we have to be an active member in re-engaging them in our schools.
I mean, that obviously coming from my perspective, I would second that. I think we need to, as creators of some of these tools, make it so that it doesn't feel like a big upheaval or an other that I have to go learn about in addition to all the other things I'm keeping track of in terms of my child's education. We need to be better about that and make things just be born digital, born accessible. But within that, yes, I think communication, I would agree with that with parents. We can take some of the pressure off on this is the materials and access your student has via you, the school, the campus, but they need to be included or it doesn't have the full effect. It won't be optimized.
Natalie, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think parents need to be included, but I do think that the best thing to take the burden off parents is to ensure that the school is using a curriculum that lines up with scientific evidence, both on decoding and on building academic knowledge and vocabulary. And especially for parents who may not have had access to higher education themselves, there's a limit to what they can do to build their children's academic knowledge and vocabulary. So I think, I wish it were easier for parents to find out, first of all, just what curriculum their child's school is using. That's often not easily accessible information. I think they really should have access to that information, and there should be an easier way for them to figure out, is that lining up with what science has found out about how learning works, or isn't it? Right now, it's not that easy to determine that, but there are some ways to do it. And I do think that, it has been, just on the decoding side, it's been estimated that if effective techniques were used in the classroom, 95% of all kids would be decoding just fine by the end of third grade. So that would take a tremendous burden off a lot of parents if we could get to that point.
And Sean, I think you wanted to jump in for one last comment on that.
I think everyone touched on it. It's also commitment, right? You got to be committed to this too, and honor families' cultural capital and social capital, and honor their backgrounds, and just, take chances and pull them in.
Great. Well, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
I was going to say, and recognize the parental involvement. There's a whole spectrum of levels of parental involvement, right? I mean, my parents were very involved, but never went into a schoolhouse. They had a lot of trust in the education system, but they would lean in when there was an issue, right? Because they were too busy just trying to make ends meet. And so I totally agree with Natalie. If we as an educational system focus on the right work, and strategically abandon the wrong work, the involvement of parents is to celebrate the successes of kids, not to ask the critical questions of why isn't it happening?
Thank you. So we've covered a lot of really good topics, and what I'm going to ask each of you to spend a moment or two just to leave us with when we close today is, what is one key takeaway everyone should consider after being part of this panel, making more inclusive, equitable education? What is that one thing? And I'm going to start with you, Susan.
I think just really, that we've said it a few times, and we'll keep coming back to it. This needs to be approached not as requirements and ticking boxes, but rather how do we all come together? I mean, I'm already walking away with things that Natalie said around, research and learning science, and how do we make that accessible to people who don't maybe feel like they have time to read all of that in digestible chunks. So really the power of community would be my thing. We've got to partner, all of us, to do this. It's a big lift, and to stop us going back to the status quo, we need to stay engaged with each other.
Dr. Cavazos?
I would agree with Susan. I think that today and in today's time, this is a perfect opportunity to push the reset button and use this as a launching pad to greater things. I think that technology should be used to facilitate great instruction, to provide access to students, to re-engage families in the educational programming. I think that technology is an incredible tool that can get us even further along down this journey. And let us not subject ourselves to regression to the mean, where we believe that we need to go back, because it is very powerful. It is a safe place when we say, once we're past this pandemic, let's go back to how we were. And the reality is, let's put on our equity lens and let's process everything moving forward through an equity and an access lens. Because I happen to believe that this pandemic, there were people that lost their lives because there was a literacy barrier and there was an access barrier for people to get the right information at the right time and access health situations where they could help themselves. And so let's not do that again. This is our chance to be better.
Thank you very much. Natalie, final thoughts, key takeaways?
I guess I would say that, technology, access, those are important issues, but we have to ask an even more fundamental question, which is, what are we giving students access to with technology? And if what we're giving them access to is fundamentally in conflict with what science has told us will work to enable them to learn, then we have to start with that. We have to ensure that the content and the methods that we're using are actually going to work for all kids as much as possible.
Thank you. And Dr. Robinson?
Yeah, I agree with all my colleagues that said anything. It's just giving people access and hope, helping them, opportunity, progress, and empower them, and everything my colleagues talked about, exactly what, should be doing to help families and kids and teachers too.
Thank you. I think this idea of access to the appropriate materials speaks a little bit to inclusive design and making sure that everything that our kids are using are inclusive of their needs and really address their needs, and not just, what is coming out of the box and should be good for everyone. I do want to go back to something you said, Susan, about connectivity and staying engaged. And, we're starting to build this amazing group of people. This is our second in the series of this type of conversation. We want to encourage all of you to stay engaged. And I know that we weren't able to answer everybody's questions, but as I mentioned in the beginning, we will attempt to answer your questions and get back to you. And we do encourage you to please stay in touch. We'll be hosting the third conversation in May, and we'll send information on the follow-up on that. But be sure to follow our panelists on LinkedIn to keep up with this impactful work that they're doing. We have been recording, and we will share this later this week. But I want to echo that Susan comment one more time. It's so important that we stay connected, because as a connected community, we can do so much more than we can on our own. So thank you to everyone who presented today. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope that you have a great rest of your day and look forward to talking to you soon.